This is your Energizer Hour, okay? You ready? Now, I know many of you in the audience are very good speakers. It's great to see a few familiar faces there. But I also think that maybe you might want to up that game just a little bit. Anybody? Yeah? No? Okay. And I think at any time, any of us, who do any public speaking, or not necessarily public speaking, any of us who do any speaking could probably do it a little bit better. Now, you're in for a real treat in the next hour, and I have with us a gentleman who's written a book going, Talk Like Ted, 5 Stars from Good to Great, The Storyteller's Secret, and there's a few more that I don't have. But this is just the starting point. So he's a communicator. He spent his career as a journalist, as a television anchor, as a broadcaster, and for the better part of his career now, he is probably one of the most expert communication gurus in many ways in the world. So he's a man who has not only written these books, but of course has delivered this message to corporations and to people around the world. So let's get him up here. A very warm welcome, please, for Carmine Gallo.
Okay. Thank you, Etna. I don't think I'm going to be able to match your energy, but I will do my best.
It's afternoon's a good time for me. It's sort of when I come out at dark or something like that, isn't it?
Hello. Marhaba. Nice to see you.
So it's great to have you here. And I think, not alone have I read some of these and still have more to read, so it's great to have more work to do. So I'll get a little sneak preview on this too. But tell me, Carmine, when you look at the need for communication, and the need not just for the ability to communicate, but be able to do this at an expert level and to do it with style and presence, why is that so important, and maybe more important today than possibly it's ever been?
Well, I believe that mastering the ancient art of communication and persuasion, and we can talk about why I call it an ancient art, but mastering the ancient art of persuasion is more fundamental today than ever before in history. And the reason is, and it's part of this book this is my new book called 5 Stars. I spoke to historians and scientists and economists, and they really opened my eyes on this topic. Although I've been writing books about public speaking and communication for 20 plus years, I've been studying it for 20 years, I've been writing about it for about 10, what they told me is that in the age of automation, all of us are afraid of what's going to happen with automation, big data, artificial intelligence, and yet the historians and the economists and the scientists have a little different take on it. And they say that the 21st century is the age of ideas. So this is really the first time in history when anyone with an idea can share that idea and get people to buy into that idea relatively quickly. Throughout almost all of history, we were, as you know, an agrarian society. So our value was locked up in our hands. In the UK, in the Western societies, in America, of course, then came the Industrial Revolution, and our value was locked up in the factories. So there were only a few people at the top who made a lot of wealth. Today, for the first time, anybody who has an idea can get other people excited about that idea and create either massive wealth for themselves or have a successful, much more successful entrepreneurship journey than ever before in history. So we are in the age of ideas. If you cannot communicate your idea persuasively, you'll be left behind, which is why I have come to the realization over the last few years, and I'm more confident now than ever, that those people who can connect with another person on a much more emotional level are the ones who stand out in any career, in any field. And this book is full of stories of real people, mostly young people, who have contacted me over the years and who have proudly told me about the success they've had in their careers. When you talk to them a little bit more in depth about what happened, you realize that it's because They are better public speakers. They are better communicators. They leapfrog everyone else. They get promoted faster. They get recognized by superiors faster. They get hired over people who are perhaps more skilled.
Yes, yes.
They have more skills sometimes. They have more education. And yet the people I interviewed for the book are the more successful in the companies.
Yeah. No, no, it's
It's
fascinating. Yes.
because they're better communicators.
And actually, I think there was an example several years ago, just after the financial crisis, when the Bank of England, and now it has its governor, the Canadian gentleman who's there, but it actually advertised for the first time. It used to be an appointment. And they wanted somebody, obviously, who had the skill, the expertise, who had good corporate standing, which at the time when the banking sector was misbehaving, let's say, and maybe a bit of lack of governance. And the other thing it actually said was good communication skills. I think 10 years ago that probably wasn't a requirement.
They still call it a soft skill.
Yes.
Everything we're talking about today, public speaking, persuasion, communication, they call it a soft skill, at least where I'm from. I hate that word, and I remind them that the hard data show that this soft skill is more important to your life and your success in your career than anything else. So I don't even call it a soft skill anymore.
No, I think you're so right. Yes.
I interviewed on that point. I spoke to a journalist who had been covering startups in Silicon Valley. I live in California. He had been covering startups for 20 plus years. And he told me something really interesting. He said, Carmine, 10, 15, even 20 years ago, if you had a really good idea that worked, you didn't necessarily need to be the most articulate, the best communicator. If you were a Mark Zuckerberg and you were the first to come up with Facebook and the social media platform, it didn't matter how good a communicator you were at that time.
True. Yes.
If you were Bill Gates and you came up with Microsoft, you could be socially awkward. Bill Gates has now changed considerably. He's become a much better communicator because of what he's doing now. But 30 years ago, when they came up with Microsoft, he didn't need to be.
Yes.
And the other person they mentioned was Google. Google's search engine worked. It was better than every other search engine out there. If you are Larry Page at Google, Mark Zuckerberg, or Bill Gates, if your name isn't one of them, then you need to stand out in a different way.
Yes.
How many ideas are dying and not having a chance to grow or get funded or get the support they need because the person with the idea is not doing an effective job of communicating that idea?
And also when you look back years ago and you look at the corporate world, there used to be a role for a spokesperson, which meant the CEO could get on and run the business, the engineers could get on and technically run it, the scientists could come up with new ideas. But, and again, that's probably on the entrepreneur space, they cannot hire a spokesperson. It's like, I can't hire anybody to go to the gym for me. You actually cannot hire anybody now to actually get your message across. You have to do this well yourself, and it has to come from the heart.
When I was writing this book, which is all on business storytelling, and I'll tell you why it followed Talk Like TED, but I was writing a book on business storytelling, and I interviewed Richard Branson.
Right.
And Richard Branson told me point blank, the quote's in the book, he doesn't believe it's possible to be a successful entrepreneur today without being a good storyteller. And he used the word storytelling. That's when I started thinking about writing a book just on storytelling.
Wow.
Because it's a part of persuasion, it's an element of communication, but it's one very specific element that takes some work. You have to understand it and learn and become a better storyteller. So I wrote a whole book just on storytelling. But it was interesting that one of the wealthiest men in the world, one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the world, said, if you want to be a successful entrepreneur today, you'd better be a good storyteller. We weren't even talking about storytelling.
Right. And
I didn't use the word, he did.
Yeah. But
It's
you know what, if you
fascinating,
look
so.
back on the very early Branson, he was not a great communicator. So which leads me kind of on to my next question. You know, are you born a good orator, a good communicator, or is this something that you can actually learn?
I was speaking to somebody right here in the front row earlier about that. I absolutely believe that great communicators, the greatest speakers that we know, are made. They are not born. It takes work. I have lost count of how many people I have spoken to who all of you would consider a great speaker, or maybe a TED Talk. People who have given TED Talks. I've talked to a number of them. I've interviewed them. You would be surprised at just how many were not just uncomfortable with public speaking, they were terrified of speaking in public. Richard Branson is a great example. Richard Branson has acknowledged publicly that he had a paralyzing fear of
Way
public
back.
speaking.
Oh, yeah, way back in the day.
Warren Buffett, one of the wealthiest men in the world, is very open about this and has acknowledged this many times, where early in his career, he said he had a, quote, terrifying fear of public speaking. And so he took classes and he became a teacher because he knew that he had to get over that fear if he wanted to convince and connect with a lot of people. So,
And often, I find when I do some training, some people say to me things like, I hate the sound of my own voice.
yes.
To which is something you kind of have to love to learn, isn't it?
It takes practice and it takes a lot of work. But what you'll find is that even those people who are afraid of public speaking, who are not very articulate, if they work at it, they become significantly better. And so that's why I say that great public speakers are made, they're not born. You can look at any great speech in history. If you look at Martin Luther King's speech, a lot of people will look at the I Have a Dream speech, one of the greatest speeches of the 20th century. And they'll say, well, he was a magnificent orator. What they don't tell you is that he had already given 2,500 speeches before the I Have a Dream speech. And so even Martin Luther King was in his dorm in a college, and they can hear him outside the dorm room going over the sermons and practicing. So I don't believe that that's the problem with these TED Talks, too. Here's the issue with it. You see these TED Talks,
and
you don't know what's going on behind the scenes.
Wow.
You haven't talked to a scientist who I interviewed, Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor. She has like 20 million views on TED. You don't know that she practiced that TED speech 400 times because she was so uncomfortable about giving a TED Talk. You don't see what goes on behind it. You don't see the coaching that goes on, the storytelling, how to craft a narrative. So the public speaking, the reason why I have a notebook all the time with me, even on these discussions, is because I'm learning something new every day. I learned something from Etna today. We had a conversation. I was speaking to somebody in the front row, and I took a few notes because I'm constantly learning. Public speaking is a gray area, and there's so much to learn. But that's why I believe that anyone can be a much more persuasive speaker. But the point is that you need to be persuasive today more than ever before. And persuasion simply means combining words and ideas to move people to action, to connect with their hearts and their minds. And that is a skill. It is a skill.
And also, I think sometimes some people underestimate their own ability. I think if we all look at times when we've been really happy or really annoyed, my God, are we good speakers at those times, yeah? We're usually unbelievably fabulous when you're delivering a point that you absolutely believe in. You can do even from, as a child, think about it. You know, the sort of debates we would have with our parents and how righteous we were and how great our whole delivery was. So again, I think sometimes people have to go into those times to actually think, wait a minute, I can do this. I've done it at times. Come back to TED, because, I mean, this is partly, it's in the title too.
Okay.
And you've spoken
If
to
it's
a
in
lot.
the title, I guess we should talk about it.
We should talk a little bit about it.
Okay.
But it's also, you know, you've talked to a lot of these people. Now, what you do now is not necessarily going to make every one of us a TED speaker.
Right.
But what is so valuable about the TED format? What can we all learn from it?
How many of you watch TED Talks?
Okay.
Good. Okay, so most of you, I guess that's why they're here at the seminar. So when I wrote this book, Talk Like TED, it was not meant to be a book about how to give a TED Talk. or how best to contact the organizers to give a TED Talk. The point is in the subtitle, the 9 public speaking secrets of the world's top minds. Because TED has, I think, raised the bar. It is now the gold
Yes.
standard of public speaking. But there is a structure to it. There is a method to it that anyone can learn. Whether or not you're giving a TED Talk, I think all of the components of a TED Talk are really, really valuable to learn, whether you're hunting for a job, whether you're on a job interview, whether it's a conversation, whether it's an entrepreneurial pitch of any type. Everything that TED teaches the speakers are things that all of us should be applying
Yes,
if you
yes.
want to be more persuasive. And so there's so many things we can talk about. The one I'd like to start with is, how long is a TED Talk?
Yeah.
How long? How long? No, maximum 20 minutes, but what's the official number of minutes? 18 minutes.
Yeah.
Does anybody know why TED chose 18 minutes?
I don't know that, no.
Have you heard this? Have you heard why they chose 18 minutes? It's because over 30 years of this conference, they've figured out that 18 minutes is about the appropriate length of time for a person to have a substantive discussion about a topic without putting people to sleep.
Right.
It's
Okay, I
about
like that, yes.
18 minutes. What's fascinating is since that came out, in the last few years, they study persuasion and communication in the lab. That's the fun part about what I do. I love talking to scientists and neuroscientists. One scientist found that people will get bored after about 10 minutes. After
Uh-oh,
about
we've
10
got 45,
minutes,
so we better keep moving.
do you know why we can keep this
Tell me,
moving?
yes.
Because there's 2 voices here.
Yes, yes, yes.
If it were
Okay.
one voice,
Yes,
no visuals, and
Right.
me
yes.
just droning on and on and on, no matter how good the speaker thinks they are, after approximately 10 minutes, you'll start yawning or looking at your watch, thinking about your next event.
Yeah.
It's just sort of a natural stopwatch to us. And so this whole idea of between 10 and 18 minutes is a good amount of time to get your idea across. And if John F. Kennedy can inspire the moon landing in 15 minutes, and Martin Luther King can change civil rights in 17 minutes, then I think you should be able to get any point across in 20 minutes or less.
We need to maybe pass that message around here to a few people, and probably lots of places in the world. I've been moderating too many conferences, and you're kind of going, guys, do you not know what 10 minutes looks like?
But you can, but again, there's science to this. You can reset the
Yes.
internal stopwatch. So our internal stopwatch ends at 10 minutes, but you can reset it. You can reset it by telling a story.
Yes.
All of a sudden, people start leaning in because it's different.
Yeah.
You can reset it by showing an interesting visual. You can reset it by having another
Yes.
voice come
Yeah, yeah.
enter the picture. There's different ways of resetting it, which I go into. But again, it's all based on science, Edna. It is based
Yes.
on science. But the reason why I call it ancient is because we already know how to do this.
Yes.
The scientists in the labs are finding out what we knew 2,000 years ago.
Yes.
Aristotle
You
came
look
up
back at the
with
great orators, yes.
Aristotle wrote the first book on rhetoric.
Yes.
Storytelling actually started here in the Arabian Peninsula thousands of years ago. So storytelling, the art of rhetoric by Aristotle, all of those things we knew 2,000 plus years ago. And today, there are people doing research in the labs, and they communicate all their research to me. They send me all this dense scientific material, and they think they've found a revelation. And those,
Yes.
it's funny, it's comical. They'll say things like, Carmine, we've analyzed millions of speeches and data and words, and we've come up with the secret to connecting with people. This is in one of my books. I said, what is it? What is it? Maybe I can write a whole book on this.
Yeah, right. Maybe you missed that one.
International bestseller. What is it? They said, tell the person a story. if you can tell them a story, you'll connect with their brain in a much deeper way. And they study this in the lab. One person studies neurochemicals, and he finds that when one person tells another person a personal story, that there is an increase in oxytocin in that person's brain. There is an increase in dopamine, which makes you feel good, oxytocin, which is the moral molecule, cortisol, which helps you focus and pay attention. Storytelling. I got news for the neuroscientist. We've been telling
Doing it
stories
alone.
in this region for thousands of
Yes.
years. I think we already know that.
It's so true, and all of those, the folklore and all the great stories were handed down when they weren't writing and when we didn't have iPhones and smartphones and all of that. But come back to TED. Tell me a few components that are in a TED Talk. There's certain things that are absolutely in there, and you've identified particularly
I just
3.
told you the first one. Well, first of all, it's the brevity, but the most important component, how do most TED presentations begin? Do they begin with pie charts and data and statistics? No, they begin with a story. And the more personal the story, the better. Stories have a structure. All great stories have a structure. A man named Joseph Campbell identified what he called the hero's journey in 1948 in a very famous book. A director named George Lucas read that book and created Star Wars because of what he read about great mythology. In every story, every great story has to have certain components. So even when you're telling a personal story, it has to have a journey, a setup, where there's a fall, a stumble, a failure, a hardship of some kind, and then a transformation at the end. This is a 3-act storytelling structure that all great movies have to share. I talked to some screenwriters for my latest book. Some of them are frustrated by it because they don't like formulas, but they will not, a producer in Hollywood today will not fund a movie unless it fits a 3-act structure, which is the setup. They talk about the hero before their journey begins. So everything is typically beautiful in that world. Everything is peaceful and loving. But then something happens to turn that world upside down. And usually it has to be really bad. That fall, the harder the fall, the better the story it becomes. And then Act 3 has to be the transformation. And at the end of the movie, the hero has to be transformed into a better person.
I've heard someone break down, and I still haven't seen this movie, many of you might, particularly those with children, The Lion King, into that complete sort of breakdown. And it's just fascinating.
Are Western movies popular out here? I'm sure they are. Like Bohemian Rhapsody. Yeah? So those are the kind of movies. I spoke to the screenwriter of Bohemian Rhapsody because he wrote a movie about Winston Churchill. And Winston Churchill, of course, was one of the great orators of our time. But he told me that there's very specific scenes that you have to have in every movie. So the point is, this is not a storytelling structure that we just discovered. Joseph Campbell did not discover the structure in 1948. He simply identified the structure that all great stories share. And so when you give a presentation, you should think through, what is the story that is going to support my argument? Whether I'm trying to win somebody's favor, whether I'm trying to get a job, whether I am attempting to change something for the better, what are those stories that I'm going to include? They could be personal stories. They could be a case study. But if it follows a narrative, it's more interesting. It's more compelling.
And also, prepare them and sort of file them away. I mean, I tell corporate clients to do this all the time. Remember these. Ask your frontline people what happens and hold on to these stories. Because so often you do an interview or you're talking about something and you forget. You come away and go, I should have told them about X, Y, Z. Talk to me about the importance of bringing emotion into your communication. And I know we have about only 20 minutes left, and I do want to get you involved So please get your questions ready. But talk to me about emotion.
Emotion is everything. People think that in order for me to persuade you of anything, I have to make a rational, logical argument. And what Aristotle was very good at and identified 2,000 years ago is that in order for persuasion to occur, three things have to be present. He called the first one ethos. You have to have credibility. If you're in a job interview, for example, your credibility might be your degree. That gets you through the door, or your skill level. But that's only a very small part of persuasion. The second biggest part of persuasion is what Aristotle called logos, which is making a rational or logical appeal to your reason. So when I work with executives at some of the largest companies in the world, I tell them that that is their data. Those are the statistics, the factual information. But Aristotle said the majority of your conversation, if you hope to persuade someone to change their mind, you have to reach their heart first. And that is through what he called pathos, emotion. What is the best vehicle for us to transfer our emotion to one another? That's story. That's why I focus so much on storytelling, because that is the vehicle through which I transfer my passion, my excitement, and the emotion.
Yes.
You have to have that combination. In Talk Like TED, a man who changed my life in a big way when it came to communication is one of the great TED speakers of all time. His name is Brian Stevenson. And if you haven't heard of him, go back on TED and look him up. His claim to fame on TED is that he earned TED's longest standing ovation.
Wow.
And it has many millions of views. I think it's in the top 10 or top 20. Well, Brian Stevenson lives in Alabama, and he is a human rights attorney. And so he deals with a lot of very severe suffering cases. But he's an attorney who has won cases before our highest court, the Supreme Court.
Okay.
So he knows how to persuade.
Yes.
And he's the one who first told me. I said, tell me how you do it. How did you prepare for the TED Talk? And he said, Carmine, you start with narrative. Narrative is very important for effective communication. What stories am I going to tell people to connect with them on an emotional level first? Then I'll hit them with the data. Then I'll hit them with the information. But I have to connect with them first. And he said a lot of people who I speak to, Brian Stevenson, said they don't want to hear me. They have a wall up. They don't necessarily like me. They may have heard something about me. They're defensive. So the first thing I do is I talk about my grandmother. He said, everybody has a grandmother.
Yes.
And I talk about my grandmother who gave me a sense of identity that many people in the communities I serve don't have.
Right.
Now he can get into the data. Now he can hit you over the head with the hard stuff. But he can't do that until he connects with you on an emotional level. Watch his TED Talk, 18 minutes, 70% of the TED Talk is story. So here's a guy who wins cases before the U.S. Supreme Court. 70% of his public conversations are story, 25% data.
Right. So it also brings a sense of clarity, I guess, to what you're going to talk about, and I think it makes it matter to people when they can understand and when they can identify with why does all of this data fit in, as you say, to actually deliver that story where people can see and feel, first of all, and then you tell them that this is maybe one example, that there are like 500 cases like this.
Just this week, this reminds me, Edna, just this week, Melinda Gates came out with her book called The Moment of Lift, where she talks about extreme poverty around the world. I wrote about it for Forbes. I write for Forbes, Inc., and some other platforms. She has found over the last few years, which she talks about in her book, that the best way of opening hearts and minds, which leads to action, is through telling the stories of the people she meets in impoverished villages, and not just the data. She said she can dump all the research on you and fill all 200 pages of her book, but it wouldn't connect with you. So she has learned, and she says this, the power of storytelling to change hearts and minds. So if there's one thing you can take away from the greatest TED Talks is understand that narrative is everything. It's not just delivering information, it's crafting information in a structure that fits the way we have grown up and have been accustomed to receiving information, which is through story.
And also, talking about the way we've grown up, and it depends in different countries, the education system for different people. What have you been taught at that? What have you learned? How have you been taught to present in an English class, to say a poem, to actually stand up on the stage, all of that? That is very, very different, I think, than what's happening today. Can you give me a feel for perhaps, and might be many of the limiting beliefs that some people have, because presenting in public used to be a very, very formal event.
Right.
And it had to be a very formal event. It was about respect. It was about you on the stage and people down there. It was a divide.
Yes.
That pretty much has gone away, which is nice. But now what's happening as we look towards the future?
You want to know the worst thing that's happening right now for
Tell me.
communication? This is it. This is the worst.
It's okay. He's not going to send a text now and
Because
ignore us.
what's happening, and I've done a lot of research on this in the States at least. I don't know if it's happening everywhere. But when you speak to HR recruiters, people who are hiring managers, they tell me, and this is why I want to do some research on this, they tell me that there is a noticeable difference in the last decade or 7 years or so of people who don't seem to be able to craft a compelling argument or to make eye contact and to talk to you face to face and to empathize with you. And it's interesting that they say it's noticeable in the last 7 to 10 years.
Wow.
The iPhone, the phones, the screens. We have a case in America, one of the great basketball teams in college. I know it's not big out here, but college basketball is huge out in America. And one of the college teams was an unexpected finalist in the biggest college tournament of all time. It was an unexpected finalist. And when they asked the coach, how did you bind this team together? He said, I did something really old-fashioned. I took them on a retreat, and we banned cell phones for the whole retreat. And they were forced to talk to each other and to learn about each other and to share each other's stories. And they came back more bonded as a team than ever before. So I think digital does get in the way. It does get in the way. I think that, but the whole digital economy, it's interesting. I think the way we communicated is changing because we use different tools to communicate, but this hasn't.
Yes.
The way our brains are structured to receive information has not changed for thousands of years. So if you really want to be persuasive, you need to understand, you need to study storytelling. You need to study psychology. You need to study structure, understanding how people process information.
Yeah. And again, when we look at the business world and the job market, years ago you could send in a CV, and sometimes many of us, I'm sure, have very, very, impressive CVs. And out of that CV alone, people go, oh, yeah, maybe let's bring these people in. That's not happening anymore, is it?
Do you know what Goldman Sachs is starting to do video recruiting now? So for the first time over the last few weeks, I just read about this a few weeks ago, if you want to get a job in the world's top investment bank, you need to do a video where they ask you a couple of random questions, you press record, you only get one chance.
Yes.
So you only get one chance to answer because they want to see how you're coming across. Are you someone who can make eye contact? Do you smile? Can you speak in a way that is simple and understandable and compelling? But they want to see you on video. So again, that's what I'm saying. The tools have changed. We haven't had that before. It used to be your resume on a piece of paper. So the tools
Which
have
somebody
changed.
could have written for you, and the cover letters, somebody could have written it.
But the ability to communicate face-to-face is still the same skill that was admired years ago. Right? In this, let's get some questions, but in this Five Stars book, I was absolutely fascinated because I spent a whole chapter on some of the great historical events of our time. And so I looked at the American Revolution. The American Revolution was started by people who were exceptional communicators
Yes,
and
yes.
writers. Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Most people, many people in America, did not want to revolt from Britain
Yes.
in the 1700s. They were perfectly happy. A guy named Thomas Paine wrote Common Sense, and it was so simple and easy to understand that people started thinking, that's not a bad idea. And why did they have Thomas Jefferson write the Declaration of Independence? John Adams specifically appointed Thomas Jefferson because Jefferson was the better writer. And he had internalized all the great writings of literature. And so the Declaration of Independence is a great piece of literature. So again, it all comes back to people who create movements, more often than not, are good communicators.
Let's take a look at the communicators, and particularly in America, because there's one, whether he's great or not is maybe out to question. But sometimes people think it's like he who shouts the loudest, and perhaps
You're
the
not
toughest.
going to bring this up, are you?
Why not? But again, look at many of the politicians particularly, and I think how they get out there, and it doesn't matter if they're here in America, anywhere. The fact that they can rally a crowd and they can get people behind them, and that comes not from sending out leaflets or anything. It comes from usually a really good speech.
Many politicians are master persuaders. And what's interesting, again, getting back to Aristotle, he was one of the first people who believed that persuasion is a tool. It can be used for bad, it can be used for good. But he believed that every citizen of a thriving community was obligated to be the best speaker they can be. Because if you have an idea and you cannot communicate that idea effectively, someone else is going to tell a better story.
Yes.
You may not like that person's story. Did you know that there is, I don't talk about it publicly, but I will today, there is a presidential candidate who I've met with a couple of times in the U.S.
Yeah.
They're running for president. I've met with them twice, and they've called me on the phone. And so I help them talk through their message. You want to hear?
Tell me, please.
This
Go,
is
yeah.
the real thing.
This is
I would
interesting.
not personally, I don't think they have enough experience. I would not vote for this person. But
Okay.
that's not my job.
Yes.
My job is to help you articulate your idea as best as possible, as
Yes.
effectively as possible. Then I'll let the community decide who has the best idea. But that's why everybody has an obligation to be able to express themselves clearly and effectively and successfully. You'll have much
also
better
when you-
opportunity.
When you look back, though, on the original Obama first public appearance, wasn't it at a convention that people were like, whoa, who is this guy? So there was a bit of that from way back before he even declared, way, way back.
But it makes my point
Yes.
that great speakers rise above. They're irresistible in some ways. They're noticed. So we talk about great speeches on that grand level,
Yes.
but even within a company,
Yes.
the good communicators are noticed. They stand out from the crowd.
They do.
Yeah.
Now, we do have a few questions, and we have a microphone, better still. So please, you have it. Go ahead, sir.
Yes.
I'd like to ask you a double-sided question from the audience side as well as from the speaker's side. So from the audience side, you said that scientists discovered that we have a stopwatch of 10 minutes. At the same time, you mentioned that most of the scientists that you talk to have discovered that certain trends in the way we understand the brain and psychology
Right.
are slowly fading away. So as we deal nowadays with elements such as social media that causes ADHD and other
Short attention spans.
Yes,
Yep.
exactly. It has been proven that we're starting to have a shorter attention span than that of a goldfish. So do you think that this stopwatch time is also decreasing? So that's on the audience side.
Okay.
On the speaker side, you mentioned that given that we're living in the automation age, we're starting to share more and more ideas more easily. At the same time, because this age is a lot about digital, do you think that or how much do you think that this kind of events, the public speaking events where we interact face to face with an audience, are going to decrease because we're just going to say, I'm just going to pitch my idea on a YouTube video? So audience and speakers, are things decreasing?
If things are going to decrease in terms of face-to-face, I don't see that now, because there's almost more opportunities than ever before to get your ideas out there, not just to speak on YouTube, but on videos. Most of the executives I know have video blogs now.
Yes,
right?
yes.
And some are better than others. Richard Branson has a video blog. Bill Gates has a wonderful blog. Bill Gates is one of the most interesting communicators I have seen in a long time, because he makes things that people don't want to talk about, he makes them interesting. He also lends humor. He makes them simple. He's an engaging communicator.
And I think he's done that wonderful one on toilets or something, hasn't he?
So you wouldn't be able to do that a few years ago without the advent of this digital technology. But let's talk about how the brain changes. You mentioned that attention spans are shorter. Not necessarily. My mentor is John Medina, who's a molecular biologist at the University of Washington. He wrote a fantastic book called Brain Rules. One of the most popular speeches in my country was in 1865 by a man named Abraham Lincoln, and that was the Gettysburg Address. Do you know how long the Gettysburg Address was? About 250 words. Nobody remembers the guy who spoke for 2 hours ahead of Abe Lincoln. Abe Lincoln comes out with the most perfectly written 258 words that for generations later, school kids in America had to recite and had to copy. But the point is that we always wanted our arguments to be as short as possible without being too short, but give me enough substantive information. So those things haven't really changed that much. It's fascinating that the brain itself has not changed as much as we think it is. And certainly the digital technology has not changed millions of years of how we process information. We've always liked it short. We've always liked it shorter than longer. It's interesting.
But also, because everybody is doing video, not everybody is doing good video. There's an awful lot of rambling out there at the moment. So and all the more reason why people need to step up and get better.
Well, that's why the TED Talks have a finite timeline. It's very hard. It is hard to get a complex idea across in 18 minutes. It's very difficult to do. But your presentation will be significantly more, better, stronger if you omit things that are irrelevant or things that may not push it along. That's why 18 minutes is a fantastic exercise. And it doesn't matter who you are. You have to stick to 18 minutes.
And we don't have 18 minutes, so let's roll them now.
Okay,
so
any other
roll
questions?
Them out.
Yes, sir.
Quickly,
one of the reasons when people talk, one of the reasons when they talk is that, the butterflies develop in the bellies. So do you have any medicine to prescribe for the butterflies that are being developed while talking?
Okay, so people getting nervous when they're ready to go, and then suddenly their throat dries up, the butterflies take over.
There is a psychological reason for that, and it's okay. You're supposed to be self-conscious when you're talking in front of a group, because thousands of years ago, the people who were not accepted by the tribe were kicked out. You don't want to be kicked out. You wanted to be part of that social group. So scientists are also looking at this. There is a reason for it. The best advice I ever got was by a very famous astronaut who also gave a TED Talk. His name is Chris Hadfield. And Chris Hadfield was on the International Space Station. He was a commander. And he said, Carmine, I used to be terrified of public speaking before he became an astronaut. And so he just used the same techniques that they use in space. The reason why you can have a problem in space and not panic is because they practiced that problem over and over. So he said, if you want to be a comfortable speaker, take every opportunity to do it. The more you do it, the more you realize you're going to be just fine. I thought that although it applied to something other than public speaking, I thought that was the best public speaking advice I had ever heard. That's why astronauts don't panic. They've done it a million
Yes.
times.
And
Yeah.
you see that, I think, we had talked about it before too. Who's being interviewed on television, in the news, particularly business news? We've been listening to these guys for years, but they're so good. And they know how to get their message across really quickly, and they know how to make sure that you hear them. I want to hear what you guys have to
I
say,
think-
so let's
I
roll
think
them
there's
out.
a question right-
She's running with that microphone now.
Okay.
We're bringing it over
Here-
that
one,
side the
and then-
next
and
time.
then there's
Let's
one
go.
over
We've
here.
loads.
Yes, let's do 2 questions here. Yes.
Say I'm a high school student and
I can't hear you. Sorry.
say I'm a high school student. I don't know. It's
Good.
something with the delay. It's okay.
I can hear you. You're a high school
Yeah.
senior.
I'm a little bit nervous and let me just say.
It's okay.
Say,
You're in high school. What's your name?
Buti Rashid.
Nice to meet you.
So say I'm a high school student and I give presentations instead of like maybe 30 students only.
Yeah.
And the students say, oh, you ramble a lot and say many things. And they said that storytelling is not important and also time consuming. I say that this is important. You have to tell a story, just like you said.
But again, absolutely, you're absolutely. Are you
No,
want to
no,
add
go-
to
no,
it?
no, no, go
Okay,
ahead.
so storytelling, stick with it.
Yeah.
Stick with it because you're right, and that's not just my opinion. That is the opinion of the most wealthy, successful people who I've interviewed for 3 books. Venture capitalists tell me, in Silicon Valley, the people who give the money to the startups, one of the top venture capitalists in Silicon Valley who funded Google, PayPal, Yahoo. He works at Sequoia Capital. He told me, Carmine, make sure you tell all your clients, if they come in to pitch me and they don't have a story, a journey that I feel compelled to go on, they're not going to get my money. So stick with that because you're right. You're right, and you've got the evidence to prove it.
But also, there is a point, though. Edit your story. Fine-tune your story. Don't ramble.
Well, that's why there are a few chapters in Talk Like TED that specifically go into that combination. Remember I told you, emotion is part of it. It's 1/3 of the Aristotle formula. But the rest is positioning data, factual information, appealing to reason in a way that has a logical structure. But you have to have both. That's the point.
Absolutely.
You have to have both.
Okay, we're moving on. We'll be over there in a moment. I
Okay.
promise. You're next.
I just want to say that I am diagnosed with ADHD, and watching TED Talks actually did help me for being focused
Yeah.
and listen to people's words. So it's just another reason for watching TED Talks on YouTube. It's
Do you
very
know
helpful.
why? Do you know why I am so hyper? Because I have diagnosed ADHD as well. And so people ask me, how did you write 9 books? I said, because I've got I have ideas going all the time.
Yes.
A doctor once told me, and this is interesting, a lot of people in the States look at ADHD and dyslexia and some other issues as being a negative. A doctor who is a Harvard-trained psychiatrist in ADHD said, I look at it as a gift because it makes people, the great thinkers, the creatives, they typically have ADHD. And all of a sudden, I started feeling better about
Yes.
myself. Again, it was the way he framed
Yes,
it.
yes.
The way he framed it. So,
And to harness those great
congratulations, you have the
ideas.
gift.
Yeah.
You and
there
I.
you go.
I had a question about maybe something more of the day-to-day. I mean, we talked about the overall landscape and when, let's say, giving a TED Talk, but not everyone's going to give a TED Talk and not everyone has presentations lined up. If we're
Right.
going to talk about wanting to be just more persuasive, a better communicator, what are the things you can do in your day-to-day? And I don't mean like practicing for something. I mean just in your everyday engagements, in your everyday kind of just life.
Yes, and I should have been very clear at the beginning. I did not write a book for people assuming that they were going to give a TED Talk. I just looked at some of the great TED speakers and interviewed them. What do you do? Why are you so persuasive? What are some of the things that you do that we can all look at? We can go on video and we can watch it. Some of the simplest things, though, are two things. I'm going to give you two things. One is called the big picture. This comes from John Medina, my mentor, again. The big picture. The way the mind works, if you have an idea that you want to get across to me, don't start in the details. Don't start in the middle somewhere. Give me the big picture. In one sentence, what's your idea about? Entrepreneurs who have to pitch ideas to venture capitalists, where I live in Silicon Valley, they're often asked, give me your idea in one sentence. Because if you can't tell me your idea in one sentence, you haven't really thought it through. It's too complicated. And then you can support it. So here's the second point. Stick to the rule of three.
Yes.
The rule of three is the most powerful number in communication theory. Everything from religions to literature are broken up into three parts because we only have a capacity for about 3 or 4 chunks of idea at any one time. So if you ask a person to hire you and you want them to hire you because there's 28 reasons for this company to hire you, that's too many. Find the 3 that are the most appropriate for them. So those 2 things are unbelievably effective that I offer to college students. I speak at Harvard twice a year. I offer them to Harvard students, college students, executives, entrepreneurs. Those 2 things seem to work really, really well. So no, it doesn't have to be that complicated. Communication does not have to be complicated either.
And also the rule of 3, it has a lovely rhythm to it. We do A, we do B, and then we just go and do C.
It's the first grouping.
Yes.
It's the first grouping.
Yeah.
So now start looking around. Almost everything is chunked into 3s. Yes.
Okay, Kim, we have a question. Do we have any more questions? Because we've got to wrap it up. So let's take Kim, and
They're
then
go-
we'll get
they're
you,
gonna get
madam,
mad
and then
at us
that's
in
our
the
last
back.
question. Unfortunately, let's get this one. Straight to the point, as you will.
Hello. So, Carmine, thank you so much. This is super interesting. And I also work in your field. So, I'm curious about some of the people that you say to them, you need to work with emotion, they will be completely cut off. And also, there's a stigma for a lot of women. They say, well, I learned that in business, I shouldn't be emotional. My boss will tell me I'm too emotional. So, how do you approach that? Hesitation or resistance to get into the feelings? Do you have a method or something you do to open them into that realm?
You have to come back to the formula. The formula has worked for 2,000 years. And the formula is you have to have a balance of emotion, logic, reason, and credibility. Ethos. So that is a magic formula, but you have to have both. That reminds me, Sheryl Sandberg is the COO of Facebook. She started a worldwide movement called Lean In, about empowering women in different fields and in companies. Her first presentations about Lean In, and this is true, she's admitted this, were all data heavy. Because she thought, well, I'm a woman, I need to be taken seriously, I'm just going to focus on the data and the statistics. And she said it bored a lot of people.
Wow.
And she wrote a book, the first few chapters of the book, the publisher said, this is really boring.
Right.
And so she turned around and she realized, I have to start telling people stories. I have to tell my own story about being a working woman, and I have to tell other people's stories. That book launched Lean In. So I don't believe that you can launch a major movement without a combination of logic and emotion.
And it is about having both. We're taking these 2 questions together, and then we're wrapping it up, sorry, because we're going to be thrown out. There will be something else happening. Madam.
Hi. Okay, so, during storytelling, sometimes I tend to ramble on. So how do you bring it back, to the topic at hand?
Remember I mentioned Brian Stevenson? Brian Stevenson always talks about his grandmother. And I said, Brian, I've looked you up on video, and you tell the same story all the time. He said, yeah, by now I've got it down. It's about 60 seconds, it makes the point, and it sets up my conversation. So you do have to practice at it. Nobody wants to hear you ramble for 5 minutes. That's absolutely right. A story has to have a structure and then end it and move on. The story is a segue or a complement to your next.
Yes.
Yeah.
And really it is. Keep editing it. You have a great story, it's this big, but you can actually keep bringing
Hey,
it
books
in.
start out as 400 pages, then they get edited down to 200 or so.
Exactly. Our final question, inspire us.
Hi.
Hello.
I just want to ask if the personality of someone, if he is like introvert or extrovert, would affect how could he be as a good public speaker,
Introvert?
Yeah, introvert or extrovert.
Yeah.
Because usually, like we found that in extrovert people, they are very hyper. They speak more and they are shining most of the time.
Don't let that stop you. Look up a woman named Susan Cain. Susan Cain wrote a book called The Power of Introverts. And Susan Cain has acknowledged that as an introvert, it was very hard for her to kind of come out of her shell and to be more personable. Now she not only enjoys public speaking, she's paid an enormous amount of money to give talks all over the world. And she's a very powerful speaker. So she talks about how to channel, being an introvert into something very powerful. Because the point is that all great speakers, it doesn't have anything to do with whether you're extroverted or introverted. It has to do with your passion. If you're passionate about your topic, that enthusiasm is going to come across. And that's why in most of my books, I start with passion, because that is the fundamental. And so I've worked with and I've met introverts and extroverts, both of whom are exceptional speakers. They come at it in a different way, but you can still be exceptional. So you got to have that confidence. But Susan Cain will help you. Yeah.
And again,
think we have to wrap it up.
Yeah, we have to wrap it up. But I just love that anyway, because that literally comes back to the fact that we have that passion in our own lives. When we're really happy, when we're really annoyed. I mean, nothing stops you there. So that's when you have that great passion. So, grasp that idea. We have to wrap it up. A few words of inspiration, the way we go out here, wired and inspired.
I'll wow you by saying that I've got some books I can sign. I'd love to meet as many of you as possible. I think that was the best way of ending it, is don't forget that in order to inspire, you have to be inspired yourself. So one of the things that we didn't really talk about is if your topic doesn't inspire you, you can take the formulas, you can go through the structure, you're not going to be nearly as interesting as someone who makes that topic core to who they are.
Yeah.
So that's the one thing I cannot teach. I can't teach you to pick the topic you're passionate about.
And even I think if it is in the workplace, this is where you spend most of your life. Get excited about it. So some people say, but it's a technical presentation. You're going, how cool is that?
I'd love to sign some books. I
So
hope
you
they
have to
them.
sign some books.
Thank you.
Please, thank you all so much. Carmine, thank you for
Thank
such
you.
incredible
Thank
insight.
you so much.
Really, it's been an
Nice seeing you
absolute
again,
joy.
Edna.
It's been great.
Thank
so
you,
he's gonna be
everyone.
back
Thanks
here,
for coming.
So you'll have time to maybe have a chat with him when he's signing some books. And we'll keep reading and watching all of your videos, and we'll learn more from it. That's so good. Outside, so you're signing
great. Thank you.
outside.